Hello, and welcome to this lecture in the Try WAD Walk online lecture series. My name is Marie Fujitani, and I'll be talking about tourism and national parks, dynamic linkages and contradictions. And so to start, let's refresh on the IUCN definitions of protected areas and national parks. So a protected area is a clearly defined geographical space that is meant to achieve long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. And then a national park is a large natural or near natural area that protects large-scale ecological processes and also have environmentally and culturally compatible spiritual, scientific, educational, recreational, and visitor opportunities. And so you can see that the definition of a protected area is to protect ecosystem services, and a national park is basically that, but taking it a step further, that specifically talks about recreation and visitor opportunities. And so first, let's refresh on what ecosystem services are, because that's very relevant to this. Okay, let's see here. We have some fish in the ocean, but they have no value because they're in the ocean. And here's a rainforest, an intact rainforest. But to the person who owns this land, it has no value. But if someone catches the fish in the ocean, they can sell it in the market for money, and thus it has value. And if the person who owns this tract of rainforest were to log it, they can sell the lumber for money. And then in the cleared land, they could graze cattle, for example, and sell the cattle or the milk and get money. And so this is how you can get money and value from the environment. But no, of course, this is absolute rubbish. An intact ecosystem has value, and value is not money, although sometimes it's spoken of in monetary terms so that things can be compared. But a healthy ecosystem has value. And that is where we have this concept of ecosystem services that describes the benefits that humans gain from ecosystems. And so this term ecosystem services comes from economics, goods and services. So yes, it's a very anthropocentric, human-centric sort of framework. And it's popularized by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment with the goal that markets do not account for the services that ecosystems provide. And so let's have a language to talk about the benefits that ecosystems provide to people. And so they're explicitly the benefits humans gain from ecosystems. And I'm sure you have seen this before, the different types of ecosystem services, provisioning, for example, food, materials, regulating climate, purifying water and air, and cultural, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment, but includes recreational, aesthetic, and tourism, and then supporting. So these ecosystem processes that support all the other ecosystem services to provide these benefits to humans. And so I break down cultural ecosystem services because they are intangible and a little maybe more difficult to grasp than lumber and fish or purifying air or regulating the climate. And so some examples of these are health and well-being. And this, for example, that when people go into nature, you have reduced stress, or when you recreate in nature, hiking, this also improves our health and well-being. And then next to the right, we have a jaguar and a vaquita, which is a very small porpoise that has this adorable eye spot. And they are extremely, extremely endangered and also extremely, extremely difficult to ever see. And so none of us in our lifetimes will probably ever in the wild see these animals. And yet somehow the idea that they are out there somewhere brings us utility, brings us joy, brings us value. Then in the lower left, we have an image of storks on a roof. And so this is how I'm illustrating cultural value. So for example, for Northern Europeans, the sight of storks migrating and building their nests and having these storks in the cultural landscape brings value. If it were missing, something would be lost. And then finally, tourism. And so this is, for example, some images of wildlife tourism. And so the fastest growing element of tourism, which is itself one of the fastest growing economic sectors, is nature-based tourism, which often involves excursions to national parks and wilderness areas, with this idea of getting back in touch with nature. And so if you look at all these cultural services, tourism being an obvious one, but the others are all very, very important to national parks. So again, as I said, national parks are explicitly designed for getting into the outdoors. They're hiking trails, biking trails, canoeing opportunities, and just being in nature and being de-stressed. And they protect a lot of extremely endangered species, and thus they contribute to existence value, and many of them also contribute to cultural value in a variety of different ways. And so this all links up, of course, to this concept of ecotourism, which I will provide two of the many definitions of it, and just pointing out that the purpose of ecotourism is taking care not to alter the integrity of an ecosystem while producing economic opportunities that make the conservation of natural resources beneficial to local people. So again, this is this idea of ecosystem services and taking it a step further, the idea of payment for ecosystem services. So bringing these benefits to local people in order to protect natural resources. And then the second quote talks about how ecotourism is a form of tourism that is inspired primarily by natural history. And now the more recent definitions, although this one is not so recent, 1989, but the more recent definitions of ecotourism have included an aspect of culture. In this case, in this definition, they talk about indigenous cultures. And so ecotourists visit these relatively undeveloped areas, quote unquote, to benefit the conservation of the site and the economic well-being of local residents. And so, kind of the mental model of ecotourism and the creation of national parks for the conservation of nature, the improvement of well-being for local people, looks kind of like this model of you create a national park, a park that specifically protects a natural resource, but also makes it open for tourism, is that this will create more jobs, provide payments for ecosystem services, PES, provide more revenue, and then this will lead to improved well-being for local people and improved protection of nature. And so I entitled this lecture Contradictions. And so let us interrogate each of these elements. And let's start with improved protection of nature. And so national parks are created to protect really stunning and unique features of nature. And so Christian Wittlich of Uni Bremen gave a very insightful presentation on national parks in the context of sustainability. And he talked about Yellowstone as the first national park. And you can see it is really an amazing area, not only for its geothermal pools, but as just an area that is really special in terms of wildlife as well. And so as the first national park, it became advertised and infrastructure, at first not very much, but some infrastructure was created to invite tourists specifically to see this area that was set aside and protected for kind of as um, the global or at the time the heritage, of U.S. Americans. So the shared heritage for people in the US. And so the tourists came, and there are quite some interesting accounts of what they did when they first came to Yellowstone. And so there are quite a few early reports from right after the founding. The first one mentions Old Faithful, which is a very famous geyser that erupts very reliably, and to this day, it's one of the most famous attractions in Yellowstone. And so, quote, Old Faithful has been subjected to the same indignities that have resulted in the destruction of some of the other geysers. The early visitors did not hesitate to throw logs and stones into the orifice in order that they might witness them being hurled high into the air. I mean, there's also stories of people putting laundry in it to try and clean it. all sorts of things. Quote, the ornamental work about the crater and pools had been broken and defaced, inscribed in pencil with the names of great numbers of the most undistinguished persons. And, quote, the geysers, in the slow process of centuries probably, have built up miracles of art, of an enduring though brittle material that can be ruined in 5 minutes by a vandal armed with an axe, and nearly all the craters show signs of the hopeless and unrestrained barbarity of many of their visitors. And so you can see visitors came to Yellowstone and then they left their mark. And you can see this also in national parks today, on rocks or in viewing towers carved into the wood. People leave their names behind. And that is extremely common to this day. Also, breaking rocks to take souvenirs is a huge problem in national parks to this day. Taking, pieces of wood or shells or other things. And so kind of this loving a place to death is a common theme in national parks. And so I have one more story about the unintended consequences for the natural environment of national parks. And so this is about one that has to do with the famous Wolong Nature Reserve near the Wolong Panda Center. So maybe you've seen before these photos online of dozens of baby pandas in one picture or people hugging pandas. Well, these have been most likely taken at this center as one of the successful breeding places for giant pandas. And so Liu et al. In Science documented kind of the impacts of this panda center and the reserve that was established to protect the forest habitat for wild pandas outside of the center. But they found that the forest quality and the amount of panda habitat actually decreased in the reserve area in comparison to outside the reserve area. And their paper pointed to panda tourism being a driver of this deforestation. As it opened the economy of the region, it attracted people to the region, and thus increased the rate of land clearing and firewood extraction, often to produce marketable goods for tourism. And so you can see that there are many stories of having many, many visitors coming to a place and having an impact on the natural environment that actually degrades the natural environment compared to what the goals of the reserve are. But you may say that this can be prevented by good park management. And of course, this isn't free, but the revenue generated by the park, remember, more tourism, more jobs, payment for goods and services, more money. With this money, then this can handle this. This can solve this problem. And to some extent, this is true. If done well, this is true. So Yellowstone was unfunded at the start. So not underfunded, unfunded. So the first superintendent of Yellowstone didn't even get a salary, and it remained underfunded for decades. But there are two main ways that national parks raise funding directly, and that is through fees, which are paid at entry, and concessions, that is, licensing to restaurants and tours to allow them to operate in and around the park. And there are other ways as well, but these are the two main ones. And this money can be used to cover park operating costs, conservation and educational activities. But you may be surprised to know that most parks worldwide, this direct income is insufficient to fully cover operation and management, and public funding from national governments are usually needed. So, for example, the US national parks rely on federal funding as well as philanthropic donations to operate. With large areas of land to manage, it's very difficult for parks to be self sustaining, and thus the amount they collect from visitor fees is rarely enough. They have to rely on public money. Being a national park, they usually have a source of public money, but it often isn't enough, and sometimes none at all. And so you can see how then this creates this difficulty of opening for tourists, drawing in tourists, but then not having the resources to manage them. And so this is a common kind of complaint about UNESCO World Heritage that comes with a lot of prestige, that draws a lot of tourists in, but comes with no resources to then manage these tourists. Okay, next we'll talk about improved well-being for local people. So as you can see how we've been talking about this thus far, that this kind of linear model doesn't truly capture the complexity of the situation around creating a national park and then trying to achieve these goals of improved well-being for local people and improved protection of nature. Because instead of this, it often looks more like this. As the number of tourists go up, jobs may increase, and the wealth of local people may increase, but it's much more complex. For example, visitation may increase money flowing into the community, but there are many reasons that the wealth may not stay there. For example, there's the tourism concept of leakage, where tourism dollars do not stay in a community. For example, they go to a foreign or multinational hotel, restaurant, or supermarket chain. Often, when these touristic areas are abroad and tourists want to eat something from their home country, then the food will be bought from, from outside the hosting country. And then another concept is elite capture, where a few people may profit from the revenue of a park. And this can be especially common for national parks because national parks are often run by national governments, and the national government collects the revenue, but then fails to put it back into park services. And sometimes this may be direct corruption, but sometimes this is just bureaucratic mismanagement, that this money goes into a pool and then it is not allocated back to the park well. And so the money may even not flow directly back to park management at all. And that reduces even more the resources to the park and the resources to local people who then are dealing with the possible over-tourism problem. And of course, tourism in national parks suffers from all the issues that tourism does. And so here's an example of a Gosling paper about tourism in Zanzibar, talking about the many unintended consequences of tourism that leading to degrading ecosystems. A lot of it was about competition for water. For example, tourists use a lot more water often when they're abroad, or they can be huge water consumptions, especially when you take pools into account, swimming pools, in places like these tropical islands that have very limited freshwater resources. And it can also lead to cultural shifts and loss of indigenous knowledge and practices. And in that vein, national parks, again, were created to protect, quote, wild nature. And so that was in kind of the founding statement of the first national park, Yellowstone. But most places, when first visited by Europeans, and they were viewed as wild nature, but they were actually carefully curated cultural landscapes sculpted for centuries or even millennia by humans. And this is discussed by Bodo Blichfeld's lecture, Transcending the Nature-Culture Dichotomy. And this, of course, was also the case for Yellowstone. And so 27 Native American tribes seasonally or permanently used the lands that became Yellowstone. And upon its designation as a national park, they were excluded and were indeed prohibited from entering in favor of European and Euro-American tourists. And as Yellowstone was the model for national parks worldwide, so did the indigenous management strategy of removal and relocation become policy in parks worldwide. In fact, if you look at the history of national parks around the world on every continent, you will find stories of the expulsion and exclusion of indigenous and marginalized peoples, not only from settlement, but also use. for subsistence and cultural practices. And so let's revisit this initial model, which is sort of a straw dog to critique, and see that we need to recognize that the picture is nuanced and the pathway to get there is complicated, and it includes being aware of the past and past ways of thinking in order to further really the goals of protected ecosystem services, outstanding geographical areas, and the well-being of people that depend on the areas for their lives and livelihoods and culture. So these are these core goals. And it really is a beautiful idea, this idea of national parks that are publicly supported to protect resources for the future, and specifically for use by people, that people can come and experience them and gain all of these cultural ecosystem services from them, in addition to other ecosystem services. And so I'd like to close with the statement that documented the vandalism in Yellowstone. And this is the closing statement of Oberhansley in his report, that while one regrets the early wanton destruction of natural features in the park, there is consolation in the fact that more natural wonders still exist here than in any similar area on the face of the earth, and that the people of America insist that they shall be protected forever. And so, in short, national parks are this beautiful ideal, and we must work hard as practitioners in management and as tourists to live up to these ideals. And so, while visiting a place designated as a national park as a tourist anywhere in the world, as you take in its wonders, let's think about what we can do, what we can contribute to these places and to the people who made and continue to keep them special. And so I'm excited to do this along the Wadden Sea. Thank you very much for your attention.